is Tim Huang, and as Mohan mentioned, I'm the founder of a conference called RaffleCon. Essentially, what we do is we bring together academics and people who are sort of briefly. Thanks, guys. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Briefly, sort of internet famous to talk about the past, present, and future of web culture, specifically kind of popular web culture. And glad to be here to be talking about it, I guess, in the context of fair use. So I think the easiest way to get started probably is, Ben, Kenyatta, do you want to give a quick intro about who you are, what you've done, and then we'll, I guess, jump into the discussion.
Yeah, sure. This is working? Yeah? All right. Actually, wait, really quickly, has anyone actually tried making the argument that since we never got our 40 acres and the mule, we want the beets instead? Then you know? No? Yeah? Okay, all right. Damn, I was just joking. My name is Kenyatta Cheese. I co-created a site called Know Your Meme, which is the internet meme database. And it's a giant crowdsourced documentation project, analysis project of internet culture. I don't know what else to say besides that. So. What do you do, Ben?
All right, my name is Ben Ha, and I got started by purchasing a site with cat pictures with misspelled captions on it by using rich people's money, and then I grew it into one of the largest humor networks in the world today. So my job is to make media happen in internet culture, which is kind of the realm that we all play in.
All right, let's go. Starting from the sort of beginnings of sort of popular web culture starting in the 90s, and then kind of moving into the present and talking about how, I guess, the concepts of fair use and the use of content has kind of evolved, and specifically kind of what things are sort of facing fair use as we kind of move into 2011, and I guess what we can look at. That makes kind of sense from the point of view being sort of the last panel. So I guess maybe the easiest way to start is if you guys have some thinking about how fair use used to look maybe about a decade or two ago, right, in the early 90s, and in kind of what you guys have been doing, right, Kenyatta, in sort of cataloging internet culture, and Ben in sort of building a business around it, how that looked maybe even before you guys got started, and maybe from there we can kind of build out.
Okay. So before there was broadband, before there was all this media already online for people to remix, pre-2002 or so, pre-YouTube, there wasn't a huge copyright issue because people were putting on their own content, making it out of text and words and a few photos here and there, but the scale, the industrial scale that we deal with copyright law today didn't exist back then. So, but today, pretty much everything that's created is almost instantly on the internet and therefore ripe for this remixing and reuse that we discovered.
Right, and the one thing that I would add to that is that whereas 10 years ago it was arguments about the VCRs and the DAT machines and everything else, the mode of what's interesting is that back then it was all about the mode of replication and then distribution, right? Because Warner wasn't they weren't in the music industry. They've never been in the damn music industry. They're in the duplication business, right? And that was the threat. And then now when you're in a place where the cost of duplication is near zero, send me an MP3 right now. I mean, how much does that cost, right? Then all of a sudden, that's what's actually threatening to folks who felt as if they had control over the means by which mass culture was actually replicated and distributed.
So you guys see actually one of the things leading to people to actually even care about fair use in the first place is just the fact that the internet touches more things now.
Right. It's worth fighting. It's worth suing somebody over now because there's people with money on the internet, whereas 10 years ago that wasn't really the case.
Right. And I guess with that has also become a kind of industry, right, around internet culture. And do you think that has an impact, right? Like, I guess you in running a business, sort of how does fair use impact the way you guys kind of construct the way you do things?
So people who live in the internet culture world, people like the three of us up here and many of you probably, is that we see internet not as a transactional mechanism, which was 1.0, where you go online to buy an airline ticket or you go online to find a piece of information. We no longer see the world that way. We see the internet as a place for expression, a place for remixing, a place for exchange of ideas. And the second generation of internet is really where it starts to get into murkiness about fair use. The people of internet culture generally did not see fair use the way we see the law sees fair use. It's not about being fair, it's about, is it exploitable? Is the content that's readily available out there, does it lend itself to being transformed into a different context or a different piece of work altogether? And that's what they really care about. And if the piece of content out there isn't worthy of it, fair use doesn't even apply. It's not even worth doing or worth working on. So it's a meritocratic system based on people's ideas of transforming something that was original context into something that's totally different. And that's where the battle is today, where it's like people debating abortion. There are two different arguments, they're just yelling at each other. And that's the state of the industry.
So do you think people care more now? Like,
I'm sorry, what are you saying?
well, I was going to say, so for example, none of these battles really happened with all your base, right?
Right.
Like there was sort of the remix, there was these images, and presumably what people were doing were sort of fair usey in a lot of ways, right? Sort of building on one another. And so it was quite different, I guess, in that ecosystem. Do you think, so with lolcats, for example, right? Have you guys run into any trouble, I guess, with people kind of coming back and saying, now that everybody's into lolcats, now I have a financial interest in it, and what you guys are doing isn't fair use, right? So it's different than what it was when we had all your base.
So the vast majority of problems we face with DMCA notices, and we are a processor of DMCA because we create a system in which other people can upload photos and caption them, so we're a lot like YouTube. So the problems that we run into only really deal with big media companies. The only people out there really issuing DMCA numbers in any large number or having consequences are the large media companies. It is not a law that a common individual will use to actually protect their rights. In fact, I think most people are under the impression and recognition accurately that the piece of content that you create has no meaningful economic value other than when it's in the remix, the use of remix itself.
And so I guess maybe it's, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say what's interesting is that, that the people are creating the work in a complete non-market situation, right? I'm taking a Doctor Who photo, I'm putting text on top of it, just because it's not content to me, it's communication, right? I'm using that in order to express this idea that I have. And so for them, it's the idea is, or one of the things that's interesting is that because it's non-market, that it becomes harder to actually exploit and put into a market situation unless you're doing something like either Ben or I are doing.
Right. Well, because I was going to say, there's kind of two people who might get pissed off, right? Like sort of one group of people is sort of corporations, right? Big media companies that you guys are facing off against. But I know even Know Your Meme, right, has kind of faced off against those non-market actors who still feel some ownership. Right. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
So what's really interesting is that typically our experience has been whenever you have communities that are creating non-market, quote-unquote, content, they feel a stronger sense of ownership over that content, over that work, than, say, somebody who's getting paid to actually create it. And so because of that, when someone like Ben or myself comes in and says, we want to expose this to a larger community, the reaction is, who the hell are you? You don't get this culture. You're not of this culture. So therefore, we're going to try to take you down. And of course, what's hard about it is that because it is all quote unquote anonymous culture, it's hard to actually know who is actually of the culture and who isn't. Because in that sense,
if you want to give like a concrete, that time that you guys got attacked.
That's a good one.
Or
yeah. Oh, so for example, there's a community and website called Encyclopedia Dramatica that pretty much does the same thing as does a lot of the same surface work as Know Your Meme in terms of documenting internet culture, but they're doing for a specific community and a specific audience. So that community is mostly 4chan. That audience is an audience that they're writing these entries, these sort of meme entries, only for that audience. You have to actually go there and you need a decoder ring in order to really understand what they're saying in these entries, right? And so when they saw Know Your Meme get popular, because there are other sites just like Know Your Meme out there that are trying to find ways to kind of document this stuff and understand its history and its spread and that sort of thing, they saw it as a threat to them and their culture. And I mean, this is something that, I mean, it's not wrong, right? On its surface, it's not wrong. I mean, this is what happens to hip hop. This is what happened to punk. This is what happened to tons of any subculture where all of a sudden the market comes in and sees that there is a way to commoditize the work that's being done and turn it into product. Usually, what happens is the community loses control of what's going on there, right? And so so what's interesting about the internet meme culture is that these are people who are actually able to go back and fight back. So for us, it meant, and I mean, once again, it gets kind of gray because we are of the culture, and therefore we also knew everything that was kind of going on as they were planning it. But their idea was to go in and try to take down our site, that sort of thing. They weren't necessarily successful, but they were very successful in getting us to really think about how it is that we treat the culture that we claim to want to document. Because it's not much different from, we end up going back and looking back at what happened with the documentation of like folk music during the 50s and 60s. What happened with the documentation of blues, like other cultures where somebody else has come in to try to make sense of something, and what kind of results from that.
Right. I think what's interesting here is actually we're talking about there's a conceptual split going on here, right? Because the kind of fair use that Ben's talking about is actually not the kind of fair use you're talking about. What I mean by that is there's a kind of legal fair use that Ben's facing off against, right? That's kind of wielded by corporations. And then there's kind of a fair use law of the internet in some ways, right? And those are different mechanisms, right? Like the corporations come with lawyers, the internet people come with DDoS, right? And like there's some question of right, and there's some question about which these are disjoint, right? Like it doesn't turn out that the legal fair use is the same thing as the internet's law of fair use, right? And insofar there's that break. I don't want to put that out there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's what I mean by this. These two groups kind of arguing, shouting at each other about two completely different things. So there's a sense of ownership, which is what the internet's really interested in, and there's the legal right to profit from ownership that the corporations are interested in. And the laws that are designed today only protect the rights of the corporation. Like, for example, statutory damages awarded to copyrights are only awarded if you register the copyright within, I believe it's like 90 days of the first publication, right? Okay, great. In this day and age of instant publishing to a blog, define publication and let's figure out the type of people who would sit there, look at their family photo that's maybe interesting to them, and say, I really should register with the Copyright Office, right? Who does that protect, right? I mean, that doesn't happen anymore. So the law that's actually on the books today is only really meant for the economic rights owner to profit at a large scale. And that's actually very troubling to me because it doesn't actually match with the cultural norm of the internet. And if you think that's really weird that we should address the cultural norm of the internet, look forward 10 years when all media is on the internet and look at the culture that's dominating the discourse, right? And that's the one that we have to protect.
So there's a really interesting question of, I don't know, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, that was good.
Okay, yeah, there's a really interesting question around infrastructure here, though, right? Where like the main reason you use DDoS to enforce the law of the internet, right, is because you have no other recourse. There's no court you can go to. There's no copyright office for the internet, right? And that's why people are taking it upon themselves to do certain things. But it's messy, right? It's actually not perhaps not the most effective or constructive method of enforcing your fair use online. So do you think there's room for kind of internet institution or internet infrastructure or even some shared norms around what that looks like, right? If we say institutions are going to be too slow, is there something else we would want to build, or is the kind of vigilante DDoS the most effective way of kind of arbitrating these disputes online? I don't know if that was a little too much, but...
Yeah, so I have a fundamental disconnect with the way people see internet content than how most profit-making organizations see internet content. So I think in terms of internet content as what I call molecular content. I touched this table, a few molecules of this table has gone off into my hand. However, substantially nothing has changed about this table. And that's how most internet culture sees content today. You take a screenshot from a movie, you go caption it, that movie has not reduced its value in any meaningful shape or form. However, those media companies will go set DMCA notices against that screenshot. So in a world where things are infinitely replicable, there is no loss to the original work if you take a small, meaningless portion. However, What we do is that in an economy that is more and more dependent on idea and creativity, the ability for me to take molecular content and make it into something else has a tremendous economic and social value. In fact, I would argue that the greatest export of the United States is no longer financial services or economical, but it is mostly cultural. And it is this cultural influence that we have around the globe that allows us to still maintain this hegemonic dominance.
And I would add to that, I mean, going back to the example of Jamaica, seeing, actually taking sort of culturally hegemonic work and taking it and claiming it as your own and remixing it, I think is extremely, extremely important in terms of like creating a culture of resistance. Because, an institution may not, I love public knowledge, I love AFF. I'm not sure that in an institution, and I love the Stanford Fair Use Project, but those are all very useful when going up against things like the downfall issue, but it would never protect, say, 4chan, or I'm sorry, I forgot the DeviantArt artist who created Rage Guy, which is somebody who just created this comic or created this illustration and became very popular as an image online called Rage Guy. And Hot Topic took it, the Hot Topic company, in the malls, right? They took it and turned it into T-shirts, and said, well, it's fair use, right? It just exists on the internet, and so I'm not sure.
Wah wah.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure if an institution, one of the institutions that we have right now to kind of protect, to actually protect the other direction, right, would work in that situation. Similarly, it was a shame because the sort of groundswell of activism that tried to take Rage Guy down, or tried to keep Hot Topic from selling Rage Guy shirts. What they ended up doing was it was kind of clever, but it wasn't clever enough. What they did was they tried to craft this message that, well, actually Rage Guy is actually race guy, and it's actually this racist thing. And so Hot Topic, you don't want to be associated with a racist, with a racist meme, so therefore you should stop selling it. And Hot Topic originally, they stopped selling for a second, but then they wised up. They did their research and they found out that that it wasn't true. And so I would say that in that case the tactic was wrong. If anything, they should have, gone to every single Hot Topic, bought all the shirts, taken off market, and then a week later, everyone returns them or something, in order to fuck with them. But there's this idea that I feel as if an institution isn't right, but a lot of the actions that we're starting to see happen need to become a little more sophisticated.
Right, because you'll say there's a kind of tension there, right? Because on one hand, you're saying we don't want an institution online because maybe that's not the most effective way of doing things. On the other hand, you also give a case in which the resistance was ineffective in some ways, right? Like Hot Topic sold it, made money, and the wheels of commerce continue to move on, right? So I guess if we feel that maybe an institution isn't the right way, but the existing methods don't work either, then do you have any examples in which kind of saying we don't need an institution to negotiate this kind of law of fair use on the internet? What is the most effective strategy?
I actually think that the current status quo that we have with DMCA is actually rather surprisingly highly effective. Because the economics of enforcing a DMCA are really, really low. And if you counter a DMCA notice, you're unlikely to be actually sued by the original media organization. At least that's what YouTube is reporting. So the law of DMCA basically creates a DMZ between everybody to some degree. And I think it's actually very, very effective. A way to control fair use is that it's not worth going after. So, I would actually argue that we would move more towards a repealing of the copyright laws and move to a more copy-free system over the long term. But the current status quo is actually not a bad one.
Right. Although basically what you're saying is that there's an extent to which it's not worth it because it's not worth enough. Yet, right? So there's this really interesting issue where people are looking at you, right? Cheeseburger. Oh man, the Cheeseburger Network. You guys employ millions of people, and you're as big as Walmart, at least on the internet.
Yeah.
And insofar as people continue to decide, oh, I want to replicate that success, or I'm just a content producer that becomes more and more valuable as time goes by, right? Do you think this DMZ is constantly thinning out? we're like approaching a position where suddenly it will actually make a lot of sense to use this system.
So the biggest threat against the DMCA, at least the safe harbor provisions where it governs a service provider. So we are a service provider. We provide a technology service that other people can upload content to, and then we distribute it. That safe harbor provision, the biggest attack on it is actually from Viacom attacking YouTube, the $1.8 billion lawsuit. And it's been pretty clear so far that the law is very concrete that says even if you're aware that there's systemic copyright violations in your system, it is not up to you to determine whether that's fair use or not. Right? It is up to the copyright owner to take into account whether that is fair use or not. And in fact, the copyright owner, by filing a DMCA notice that is does not consider fair use, could be liable for the damages of the people who violated, in your mind, the copyright in the first place. That is an incredibly powerful law in the face of all these people trying to determine what is copyright today. It creates this giant buffer. Right? There's a huge mile between what is worth going after and what they'll leave alone. So if the big media companies get their hands slapped a few times, they're going to stop. And we're very close to that. So, and on the other side, you see countries like China where practically there is no copyright law, yet media companies in China are doing just fine. Right? It's not a model for us, but it's an example where you don't need strong copyright laws in order for having an effective media system.
Can you add any thoughts?
Yeah. I would actually only add that on the cultural end, I'm interested in seeing what happens over the next 5, 10, 15 years as services, as practices like Tumblr become more popular. Because Tumblr is an ecosystem where your currency is I find an image, I find a video, whatever it is, I put it up online, and everyone else who thinks it's interesting goes in and reblogs it, right? And so that one post ends up showing up in dozens of places. If some people like it, but possibly hundreds or thousands of places as well. And so all of a sudden it kind of changes. Your perception of what this content is in the first place, and how you actually react to it. And I always thought that the important thing about the whole P2P rush, the whole MP3 argument, and during the late '90s was that what was most important about it, it didn't matter whether or not Napster won or Kazaa stayed up or anything else. What mattered was that people understood music as a file, as a distinct file, as something that could be replicated for $0, and it completely changed the way that you related to music, right? What happens? So my thing right now is what's going to happen as we start to like rethink ideas around other forms of things that we've traditionally called artifact, that we've usually called content.
Well, and also rethinking the not as rethinking content on one hand, but also rethinking the infrastructure in some ways, right? So like another element of this discussion I think it points out is the power of the platform in some sense. It's not only setting the norms about what they'll enforce, but also kind of the structure that they build into place. But what's interesting is that it turns out that platforms online become zero-sum, seems like pretty quickly, right? Like there's a lot of social networks, but there is Facebook. There's a lot of places to upload video, but there's also YouTube. Right? And I think the most recent WikiLeaks case actually indicates the weakness of that part of the web. Right? The fact that everything's on a platform is great on some level because it allows us to rethink content, potentially sets new norms with regards to fair use, but also is ultimately weak on some concrete level, which is I can threaten the people who host your site and you're down. Right? So in some sense, maybe that buffer that you just indicated is subverted in some sense by the fact that now content takes place on a smaller number of platforms. Like why do I need to after every single guy when I could just talk to the guy who hosts you?
Yeah, actually, the modern approach to legally attacking a copyright violation, in the copyright owner's view, is not an attack on the copyright law, it's actually an attack on the distribution system, right? Because the number of distribution systems that are effective enough for that copyright to become of any value is so limited, and you're right. Yeah, and that's where we run into these problems.
Right. So maybe this might be room for some legal stuff, right? Maybe we want a legal shield around platforms in some ways. Because there's an interesting parallel in the content world, right? Where it used to be we'll sue people who are downloading music. Now let's just push ISPs to filter, right? And it's also a lot more difficult to detect in some ways, right? Sorry, Kenya, I was about to say something.
No. Well, I mean, or actually, yeah. Well, I was just going to say that, I feel like the alt world, our first reaction is always, well, forget that, then we're going to build our own, right? So we build our own content management systems, we build our own video hosting systems, et cetera, and none of it has the effectiveness of say, for example, YouTube or Amazon S3 in the case of WikiLeaks, et cetera. And so again, I don't think it's going off and running and playing in our own sandbox, but going to people who are who we do want to work with, Amazon, Google, et cetera, and telling them that there needs to be space for this, that they need to have a different sort of relationship to this content.
Oh, interesting. Okay, right. So that the idea is that some businesses, some infrastructures may actually end up embodying the law of the internet in some ways.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a cultural problem. For those of us who live on the internet, technologies are like our first language. And so when we face a legal threat against what we do, our response isn't let's go change the law. It's let's go create a better technology that circumvents the law. Right? That's our initial response, and then there's more lawyers involved. So that's kind of a problematic response where we believe that the law of the internet is actually the code that runs it, not the legal code that underpins all of our systems.
Right. Although definitely, I mean, in terms of the fact that internet culture in some ways is also attracting, like those old infrastructures are now becoming interoperable with the internet, right? So 2008, I feel, is such a great year because like years before that, right? Like there's this big question around like now there's a whole scene of people who will publish books, blog to book, right? Like that's publishing industry just finding a way of becoming interoperable with what's going on, right? And now for TV and everything else like that, right? So in some ways, do you think maybe the fact that we used to think that, right, that technology is kind of independent and we're going to just build this new tool is going to be in trouble, right, as these bigger players end up starting to hook in, or maybe not bigger, but certainly existing players, you know?
I think that's kind of funny. You know, we'd like to think that the old media world has kind of caught on and gotten a sense for the internet. I would actually argue that we're still so far from it. I was working with a late night TV show on one of the networks, and you know, I was in their offices, and we're talking about some ideas for a segment and things like that. And the head writer comes to me and says, "Look at these images that we found on the internet. We're going to use on our show." And I was like, "Hey, this is actually from our site. We actually own copyright to some of these. I mean, you're free to use it. I'm cool with it, but this isn't just stuff that happens on the internet." In fact, in the book, you know, the old media really does. It's like ingrained in there. The book Game Changer, right, about the Obama election, or the last elections and stuff like that. There's a sequence where Valerie Jarrett prints out a photo during the middle of Palin Mania, and it says it's got Barack Obama facing and pointing at the camera from a podium, and it says, "Chill the fuck out. I got this." Right, and it's one of those really iconic images that made all the way throughout the internet. And the book described Valerie Jarrett showing it to Barack, and he says, "That's exactly what I'm talking about." And they reference it and say, "It's from the internet." And I'm looking at the image going, "That's from our site." And we get zero credit whatsoever for creating this image as part of history. We get a line that says, "From the internet." And it actually has a little URL printed on the bottom of the image. And I looked it up, and I was like, "Come on, guys!" You know, it's this one-way, idea that if traditional media creates content, it's copyrighted, but if internet people create it, it's not.
Right. I think that's actually a really funny thing, right? Like even the use of the word internet as a destination and an organism, right? So like no one says, "Oh, it's from the TV," right? I mean, no one ever does that, right? But people do say, "Oh, it's from the internet," right? And it's weird too because I guess it conflates two things, right? Because there's credit to you guys, but there's also credit to the person who originally created the image, right?
That's what's really fascinating.
Right.
Is that somebody somewhere had to have created this content.
So, do you think there's actually this cognitive model, right? Like we think the internet's made of internet, right? Versus the internet is made of people who are producing, and that may actually have an impact on how we deal with it, right? I don't know, can you? No, nothing. All right. I think,
although actually, one question: was that image created by one of your staffers, or was it created by one of your users and uploaded?
It was a Newswire image that somebody had captioned using our tool, one of our members on our site. And so it's one of those cases where had they looked at the URL, contacted the site, we could have easily gotten them the credit of the person who actually made that image, and that person could have had a little footnote in immortality. But that's gone.
it's from the internet.
It's from the internet. One up for the internet.
Right. Yeah. Plus one.
Yeah.
That's all.
I mean, if you look at the most credited people on Earth right now, it's the internet.
Yeah. You go, guy. Yeah. All right, so we're hitting about midpoint right now, so I think we'll just transition to questions. I think we covered a lot of ground, so I think there might be stuff to flesh out or shoot.
No, here, 1 second, here.
I've heard several other people say today, and I just heard reiterated, let's get rid of the copyright system. Or, let's just completely dismantle it. But then it also, almost a sentence later said the DMCA actually has some pretty good protections, which we actually copied YouTube's DMCA notice for our own site. So we may have violated the DMCA in copying their own DMCA notice. Very meta. But it seems to me like with your example there, that's a situation where content from the internet goes uncredited. The only thing that can prevent something like that is something pretty darn similar to a copyright system. So I want to clarify, because it seems like, I'm not a fan of big companies, but it seems like there's a double standard here and we're vilifying them. When they steal stuff from us, it's wrong. When we, quote unquote, steal stuff from them, let's get rid of the copyright system.
So there's a difference between codification of practice and cultural adaptation of the norm, right? So when we talk about crediting people, we're not going to sue because they didn't credit someone, right? Even if it was one of our users. What we're asking is a common courtesy to look it up and say, not just the internet, but maybe somebody behind the internet had something to do with that. Now, the other side of the fence is law, putting into practice putting the law of practice that must be applied for everyone. And there's a big difference between the two. And if you ask the internet, we will most likely say they would much rather have cultural norms be adopted across the board versus codification of law.
Also, I want to sue someone for taking my copyright policy on my site. That'd be awesome. Next.
So Ben just got at something that I think really helped clarify some confusion that I thought I heard earlier. So Tim, when you were talking about the law of copyright and the law of the internet, what you were really referring to was not law, but social norms, which we might sort of abstractly refer to as law. But social norms function in a different way. They're created by societies and they're enforced not in courts, but in the court of public opinion with penalties like ostricism
and also your site being taken down, right?
Well,
there's like some concrete enforcement of that
right.
law.
Well, so ostracizing somebody might be a DDoS attack, right? But it's a sort of a different kind of penalty. And so to make a sort of to offer a somewhat Lessig-like proposition here, on the one side we have these social norms that are on the internet. On the other side we have copyright law. And a lot of the conflict that we're seeing is sort of because there's asymmetries between the normative rules that the internet community applies to itself and the copyright rules that are applied to that community. And so it is because the law is out of step with those norms that we're seeing a lot of conflict, and perhaps a solution would be found by trying to bring the law more in line with the norms, or the other way around, although obviously the latter proposition.
Right, so what you're talking about is a kind of symmetry problem, I think, that divides a lot of people who think about the web, right? Which is, and I want to get your guys' opinion too, which is, do you think it's possible to codify these norms, or codify them in a way that is consistent with the web? Or is just the very nature of codification or laws something that could never capture? Right, so there's an interesting question there, right? Whether or not you think you can craft an institution, you can craft some kind of law to actually fit and work well with the system, or if the system in some ways is just antithetical to that. I don't know if you guys have.
Yeah, I would say yeah, of course. We crafted copyright law to serve a particular, and we've changed it over time in order to serve a particular use, which is usually market, right? But because the idea of cultural production is now not necessarily tied to systems of production, traditional economic production, it just means we need to reflect that, right? And so whether it's starting off with the first step is less Creative Commons, the next step is how do you take what's the best of the DMCA with alternative forms of copyright and a better understanding of actual practice online and use that as a basis for which to form more sensible copyright laws.
I think that the biggest asymmetry between legislation and the culture and practice of the internet is not the wording or the enforcement, it's time, right? The internet moves at such a rapid pace, and trust me, it's not going to slow down. It's only going to speed up. The legal system still operates by the operating system written several hundred years ago. And that operating system does not have the flexibility to adapt to the model of the internet. And so the closest thing that we have to a legal system that operates with the flexibility of the internet is common law. And what I'm advocating is an institution of common law that people on the internet generally agreed by, but maybe doesn't have the teeth of the actual legal system.
Could have the teeth. That would actually be a really interesting norm as well, right? Like if you violate it, we'll take you down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the punishment does not appear to be anything like something that we witnessed today.
Right. So in some ways, you think that like the symmetry could be made, but for all practical intents and purposes, like to update the system, you would also have to update the whole government, and to update the whole government, you'd have to, so on and so forth, right? Cool.
And good luck like getting normative symmetry between governments and cultures across the world. We forget that the internet is global. It is not just the United States. So.
Cool.
I have a question. Fascinating discussion, by the way. I'm curious what your relationship is to the 4chan boards now, in general, or like.
I've dated them. They're really not good at that.
And even Moot in particular, and how you said you learned from the dedicated denial of service attacks to like, take the subcultures more seriously. How exactly did you? I don't know. Yeah, how did you learn from it? How did you incorporate them to your websites? Or it's a complicated.
Time heals all wounds, and they find bigger fish to fry than little guys like us. I mean,
Well, they went from you to me.
yeah, bigger fish. So that's. I mean, it's very hard to say, but it is a symbiotic relationship that the parties don't want to necessarily acknowledge, right? I mean, mainstreaming of internet culture brings more people into the ecosystem of 4chan, who then understand the cultural norms, who then create more content, and then becomes more mainstream. It's a cycle that's not just acknowledged by all the parties involved. That's basically how I would describe it.
Yeah, my favorite example, so at RaffleCon we've had kind of a lot of interactions. My favorite example is, you ever see the old Warner Brothers cartoon where the coyote and the dog, the sheepdog, clock into work in the morning, and they spend the rest of the next 20 minutes fighting, and then at the very end they clock out, and then they're kind of friends again? I feel it's that way with a lot of stuff on the internet. I'll just leave it at that. Next. Yep, go ahead. Oh, I think, yep, just got right behind you.
What kind of struck me about that Rage Guy example seemed to be the biggest issue, kind of going back to what Dave said before, is, the problems of, kind of corporations or big media, whatever, stealing stuff off the internet culture and then trying to profit from it. So I guess a kind of a two-part question. Would it be as big a deal if they were doing that without necessarily trying to make any money off of it? And second of all, would Creative Commons just be, an easy way to solve most of that issue?
Okay, two things. First, first question, I would say no. Adult Swim, the TV network-ish thing, took a different image, a different internet meme called Courage Wolf, and use it in a bunch of interstitials that they've come up with. And the big mass that is called the internet saw it, got really upset, and went and flooded their forums and tried to do a DDoS, and they were nominally successful, but they were upset. They were really they're really upset, really mad, because once again, it's not necessarily just about not just about the money, but it's about reappropriating their culture into a context that doesn't necessarily make sense. I mean, that was actually the reason why we created Know Your Meme, was that we were seeing a lot of this meme stuff show up in commercial context with no credit given to. I mean, if I could, I would give you the credit. But where there wasn't credit being given, and I feel as if there are lots of. It's not going to be a blanket sort of thing, but there are lots of cases where, as long as people know where it's come from, and when you use it, then that's kind of sometimes acknowledgement enough. Not always, but sometimes acknowledgement.
Yeah, I think you have to give corporations the same right over public domain content, such as Rage Guy. And I would actually, at this point, call it public domain, because I think most economic value is derived not at the creation, not the point of creation, of the idea, but at the execution of the idea. And the vast majority of the execution of Rage Guy has occurred basically in the public domain, of people releasing that content into the open and not enforcing that copyright. So what's actually happening when corporations take, quote unquote, this culture and put it on a commercialized entity, is that they have just as much right to work with and advance that cause as the people who were actually involved in getting it off the ground. But right now, the battle over DDoSing and getting pissed off about this is not over copyright, but it's over identity. right? It's a politics of identity. We are not big media, and the whole issue about money and profit isn't about copyright, but it's about the fact that the culture that creates this content is in love with the idea that ideas are free and therefore cannot be should not be commercialized.
This is the same way that I felt when Jungle Brothers went from being interesting hip hop / house group to their more sort of commercial friendly iteration. And when I saw, I was pissed. I was upset. This would no longer represented me. And to somebody who is, at any age, it doesn't matter if you're a 15-year-old or you're a 50-year-old. Anytime you have somebody coming in and redefining your culture and taking that meaning away from you, that hurts, right?
And part of it, I think, is almost inherent to the nature of the internet as an enormous copy machine, right? Like, I was really struck by Ben Sisto's project this morning, which, if you remember, where he took basically a picture of Darwin and continued to photograph it or copy it over and over and over again until it lost kind of any dimension or shape or whatever. And he was relating this experiment where he would lay them all out in a line and say, okay, tell me the point at which it no longer is the ownership of one person. Right, and this is a fantastically difficult problem because people have a lot of trouble trying to figure out where that line is. And I think the blurriness of that line, the fact that copying happens all the time, makes that line of like, okay, when is it public domain and when is it not, a really difficult issue.
And actually, that's a great example. Sorry, I wasn't here for that. But that was a great example of why I feel like the copyright laws need to be repealed back to a point where we're really kind of opening this up to common law and public domain discussion to actually figure this out, because that line is so blurry and is so arbitrarily determined, so arbitrarily enforced that we basically have a legal system that is not fair, right? The irony of fair use is that it is unfair to the vast majority of people who do not have the means to actually protect themselves. So because content is not a monolithic thing that gets moved from point A to point B, like it used to be, we need to figure out a way to give liberty to those who want to make speech out of that.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a really interesting idea. So in the common law, right, you have judges that make decisions and kind of, there's sort of an emergent structuring of like kind of what is good and what is wanted. There's an institution within the legal world in the form of what they call restatements. Basically, the idea is a bunch of really respected people will come together and they'll put down what's not designed to be something constraining, but just a statement of what the decisions are, what the laws are. Do you think there's a possibility for something like that on the internet, or is it too big of a sprawling? Is the internet too big and sprawling for you to ever consider doing that?
If Gandalf and Longcat and Han Solo came together and said this is the restatement, we might listen to it. But who do we respect? Right? I mean, does the internet respect anyone? It only respects the freedom that we're allowed to have on the internet, and that's part of the problem.
And that's why even the idea that corporations should have right to public domain, that argument still just rings false to me, unfortunately, because when you have people who are creating content in a sort of non-market, and granted, I've actually commoditized the content in a way that is that's less brash than Ben, but also means that he's going to actually do more for the space in terms of challenges of copyright than I ever will, right? And it's because I try to respect the original intent of, you don't want this to be market material, so therefore I'm only going to create work on top of it, right? But that doesn't necessarily and I can't right now, because of the way because of that sort of asynchronous nature of profit on the one end, cultural creation on the other. I can't see that ever working out.
So the biggest kind of problem with making public use content and actually creating a business around it is not around copyright, because anybody else can go out and actually create more works based on the public domain, but actually the challenge becomes on trademark. So we had an interesting case where I think one of the big comic companies took an image that a user in our system created of this kid swimming in the water, and he's got like half his face is underwater, and then there's a monkey riding on his head, like grabbing onto his hair, and the monkey kind of looks sad. And then somebody wrote, "Hitman Monkey does not enjoy his job," right? And so basically the inference is the monkey's drowning this poor kid and not having a fun time doing it. And then one of these major comic companies actually took that picture and said, oh, it's from the internet, we're going to create a comic around this. And again, credit to the internet. And so they actually started producing comics based around the trademark of Hitman Monkey. And so we're sitting there going, what do we do about this, right? How do we actually allow them to recognize that, again, it's not the internet that's making this stuff. There's someone somewhere who made that content, and how do we get them the right credit? About going back to the idea of credit being the currency of the internet.
I just realized the only way this works, and this might be a joke that's only funny between you and I, is that you have to become the Facebook of internet memes. You have to become the only space for it.
Cool, so I've just been informed that we should start wrapping this up, but can we take one more question maybe? If there's one more question, I guess we'll do that, and then... well, yeah, you've had your hand raised for a while. Sure.
And a lot of this has to do with the copyright education, particularly of our young people. It's amazing to me, copyright, although it is codified, it is in law, and it's part of our honor code at most universities, it's completely an ethical issue. And if you can't teach ethics to these young people in dealing with this, in terms of looking at it like, okay, let's say you have this content, and as soon as it's fixed in some sort of format, it's copyrighted, then you own that material essentially, unless you say it's available through a Creative Commons license or whatever. It's not in the public domain automatically.
Yeah, I mean,
so
Let me know.
I actually disagree with the statement that copyright is an ethical issue. Crediting and plagiarism is an ethical issue. Copyright is a commercial issue. It's an issue of business. I mean, that's the way I see
But
it.
to a young person,
I see,
it is
yeah.
an ethical. You have to sort of say, to me, it's like you can speed in your car if you want to. It's against the law, and if you get caught, you might get busted, get a big ticket, might hit somebody, whatever. But
What do you think is the advantage? Like, what to you is the advantage of presenting it as an ethical issue?
I'm just trying to reach students in any way I possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think no doubt, like, education is a big part of this, right? Like, just understanding the issue.
But when the law does not reflect society's view on the rights of the people who create content, that's a big problem, right? That we're educating people about a law that does not conform to the moral standards of the students. That's why you're having an ethical dilemma.
Well, and also, like, it's also damned by its history in some ways, right? Like, when you think of copyright education, you think about don't copy that floppy, right?
Right.
Or any of the other number of, like, or like you wouldn't steal a car, that kind of stuff. And I think, like, no doubt that plays a big problem, right? Because someone, like, I heard a little routine once where someone was like, yeah, it's true, I wouldn't steal a car. But if my friend said, I just bought this really great car, can I photocopy that car for you? And I was like, yes, that's very true, right? Like, the education that you have out there in some ways doesn't necessarily correspond.
I would engage the students in a way that talks about, copyright and its economy and the ethics and how people perceive it in the culture. If you address it in practical terms of, like, if your friend said something on Facebook and you tweeted it and didn't credit them, where's the violation? All that stuff would be kind of fascinating, right? Playing in that murky zone in the world that they live in, which is, well, I don't know where that code came from, right? So.
And I would actually add to that actually two things. First, it would have been great to have an education panel about fair use, maybe for next time. You had it last year. Oh, damn. Thought it was gonna be good. But the other thing is that so the Know Your Meme community. Know Your Memes community is made up of, a good portion of them are high school age students, and there are people, and they're young people who aren't necessarily doing well in school, and they're not learning about copyright, they're not learning about statistics, they're not learning about research methods within the school environment. However, on the site, because they're actually going out and documenting internet culture, because they're actually having to look up history, because they're actually having to look at things like Google Analytics, and because they're actually having to look at things like what does fair use mean, what does Creative Commons mean, they're actually learning more about these things because of the practical connection than they are in school, which is badass.
I just had a thought, which was
Shoot.
I just came up with a brand new term. When you DDoS a site and try to bring it down because somebody violated your copyright, I think it should be called copy violence. Yeah, because it's like that's as violent as physical as you can get on the internet is to DDoS someone. Yeah, I'll trademark that right now.
Cool. And on that note, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.